Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you all today. Um, I'm gonna today just focus on what we pretty much focus on entirely in our breeding for the cattle that we sell, for the breeding stock we sell, and that's essentially just functional fertility in the cattle within a system that has limited inputs. Um, and just to give a little bit of a background on that is, when we started out with Pedigree Angus in about 2013, about 10 years ago now. And I went and bought cattle from all the top breeders, or a lot of the top breeders, and some other places as well, and just had all the promises made in the world, and went through an extremely expensive process for about 5 or 6 years, and at some points getting pretty close to the line, because simply the cattle didn't work, and in particular the high numbered cattle that with the estimated breeding values and the algorithms that are used to work out how these animals will perform in any system, and you look at those that are supposed to be, according to the best science, they're supposed to work for you, and the reality is, for us they didn't, and so we had to go through that process, which was pretty painful. But in the process, sort of, we found really what did work, and sort of scoured the internet and the world, and made contacts, and found out what other people had done, what had been gone on elsewhere, and then applied that to what we do. I kind of always start as well with the presentations to say a lot of the information is based on a lot of other people's information. This isn't all my information. It's stuff I've collected together and then applied myself, and seen what I think works and what doesn't. So it's not all mine. This is on the backs of lots of other people's work. And then the other thing to say is that we use holistic management as a decision-making framework. Been using that for 10 or 11 years now, and that's made all the difference to our business, and really has informed a lot of the decisions we've made on breeding, as well as how we manage our grass and our ecosystems as well. So that's a really important part of what we do. So a little bit about us. We'll have about 150 Pedigree Angus to the bull next year. We may be carving about 150, and that will include my girlfriend's Pedigree Angus cows as well. And we're just working together to bring our businesses together on that front at the moment as well. And we farm here down in Worcestershire about just over 1,000 acres of diverse pasture, and we're completely organic. All the cattle are out wintered, and I also have a background as an ecologist as well. So I've worked as a professional ecologist for various organisations and NGOs and Natural England and others, and so that's always been a background for us. We want to have farming systems that have the biggest ecological outcome they can have, whilst also being productive and providing family farms with a really good living. And what I realised early on was, unless we have the right cattle, then we're not going to be able to do that. Certainly not just in terms of setting up our own herd, but doing consultancy on some fairly big estates, some in Scotland and elsewhere, and keeping some really high production cattle, Charolais types and Simmental and Continental crosses, and finding that they were just not coping in the mod grazed, entirely grass fed system. So it's really important to have cattle that are going to work for you. And I think the good news at the start of this presentation is, on the whole, you can breed your way there yourself. You don't need to don't need to go far in order to change your genetics. If you've got native breeds, you're going to have a good base. And I hope that the long-term outcome of some of this work might be that there's just, everyone's kind of breeding their own bulls. Perhaps they don't need people even breeding pedigree bulls for them. If we're all breeding our own, and that means there should be loads of cattle around the country that are really well adapted and productive. And so the whole sector is, supplied with good cattle right throughout. And that's sort of the hope in the long term. So if we think about what we actually want from a cow and what we think every cow should do, essentially a marketable calf every year, on time, problem free, is where we're at. And I think, there are plenty of people out there farming in systems where they don't even mind if there are problems as well. But if they get a big calf or whatever, but we'll talk about that a bit later.
Rob, your slides haven't moved on. Were you anticipating them moving on?
Yeah, they have on my screen.
No, we're still looking at focus on the feminine. It's all about the cow. First slide.
Okay.
Rob, when you share the screen, you need to make sure that you share the whole screen, not just one
The window.
thing. Yeah.
Okay, let me just try. I'm going to stop sharing and then go back
That
in.
has moved. That has moved now.
Yeah, it's probably gone onto the window. So if I come back into here, let's see if we can do this. Entire screen. How are we going to get that? Okay, let's see.
Doing something.
So can you see now? You should all be able to see Rob. Is that right? And then
so now we've got your.
What can you see?
We've got the second slide with two bulls, a red Angus and a black Angus on the right hand side. Now we've got what do we want from a cow / you.
Okay. Hopefully this will work. Sorry about that. So yeah, so what we want is a marketable calf every year, on time, problem free. You can achieve that with inputs or without, but one of those comes with a lot of cost, and to be honest, not much reward or extra margin on the whole, and probably more risk. But it does depend on what your goals are, what your context is. If you really enjoy feeding cattle, if you really enjoy getting them to win Christmas fat stock and all that sort of stuff, then that might be what you want to do. And so I'm not, there's no one should tell you otherwise, really. But there are some things that we do need to think about when we make those choices. And I think one of them, you can see C-section on the screen there, and some of the breeds, particularly the continental breeds, Belgian Blues, some of the Limousins, they're going to be C-sections every single time they calve. They can maybe calve 3 or 4 times if you're lucky. I was speaking to a pedigree Charolais breeder, and those big cows are having a calf every 18 months, trimming feet routinely every year, every single animal. And so whilst those costs they might feel are rewarded by high sale prices, I don't see how that actually fits into the commercial situation of the farmer who's just trying to produce as much as much as they can from what the environment provides. Whether she's farming 1,000 acres or 50, we need cows that produce a calf every year, and then we just need these things to work for us as we otherwise these systems don't have a lot of profit in them, and so we need to make sure the margins work in every situation. So key for us as well is to kind of define our whole under management. So what our goals or our context is, how we want to manage. We've got a lovely view there of the Kemerton estate with some of the cattle on the hill there on just on the lower slopes of Breeden Hill. What is your context? Where are you farming? And what are your key goals for the business? One of the things we try and focus on, that holistic management framework gives us, is a focus on solar dollars versus paper dollars. So we don't want to be sort of spending money to solve problems or to provide production as much as we can. We want to be relying on the free energy that we get from the sun and the fact that it rains. And if we can harness that and plant physiology and work in harmony with all of that, then it's going to be more likely that we can cash flow a profitable business. And we want to make sure that aiming at a maximum sustainable profit, sustainable in all senses, but not a maximum sustainable production. is making sure that we're producing at the point that has the maximum profit rather than the point that is the most that we can do, because our environment is limited, and so we have to produce from what the environment can provide. So the environment that we're farming in, by definition, is limited, and we can increase the available environment that we have to produce over time, and with good management, but there's still a limit. So we can, maybe improve the quality of our grass. We can improve how we manage our grass, how we move our cattle. We can reseed. We can do all sorts of things. Many of those things come with costs, whether it's labour costs or input costs. But there is still a limit. And we also have to think about what we're doing when we come back to breeding, if we're relying on good management for the productivity on our cattle. So if we choose a productivity level in the cattle that relies on management, for us, when we're managing our young bulls, for example, if we give them everything they kind of need and we don't test them at all, then we don't know that when they go on to the next place, they're going to be managed the same way. And we always want our bulls to go on and improve and grow. And people are often surprised that the bulls gain condition during a working season, because we don't necessarily move them all the time or give them everything they need, and they keep moving. While they do keep moving, we make them clean up the pastures and limit intakes a little bit and make sure that's the case. So we want to make sure that we're not relying on good management, because if we need more production, and because we've got better quality grass or better quantity of grass, we can always increase the number of cows to produce more calves. And then we haven't changed our genetic base. If we change our genetics, and then even if the management changes and is worse, even if that management stays the same, you can get changes in the environment. You could get 3 or 4 drought years. You could get some terrible wet or cold winters or whatever it is that actually changes what the environment is. And if you've made your animals more productive, which sounds like a good thing, but you could actually give them higher energy requirements, which could mean that they're going to suffer in those years and affect your profitability. So just be careful when we're looking at relying on that in terms of your breeding. There is in the industry there has been a focus particularly on individual animals, and focusing on increasing production in those individuals, selecting those best performing animals again and again, whether it be the cows that produce the biggest wean calves or the top third calves. Certainly in terms of the bulls, it's about weaning weight, it's about growth rate. But when we actually look at the best results in some of the feed efficiency trials, they haven't been able to make improvements greater than 20%. And the rate of improvement diminishes over time, and also diminishes with the addition of more inputs. So every additional input creates less of an improvement, to a point where there is no improvement. There's only so much energy available, and so no matter how clever we think we are, and no matter however we put all our figures and statistics together, none of this can rewrite the laws of thermodynamics and create energy out of nothing. And you might think it's a bit odd to include stuff about the laws of thermodynamics in a genetics presentation, but I just think it's important to go back to basic science to challenge some of the information that's out there on the estimated breeding values, because family farms have been encouraged to go after these genetics that are essentially high growth animals. If you look at any sale catalogue, a lot of the marketing is top 1% or top 5% of EBVs, which essentially, if you look at the indexes, it's all about growth rate in various different forms. And just the assumption there is that we can just keep increasing the production of individual animals over time with no consideration of the environment. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy can be transformed from one form to another, but can be neither created nor destroyed. So we can't create more energy than is coming in from the sun, the rain, and the soil that's producing the forage that we're growing. So there is always going to be a limit. And then the second law is that we have a thing called entropy. And so that's basically that in that process of converting energy, you always essentially lose some. So you're going to lose some in that process. So not only is it limited, but in the conversion process, so moving those carbohydrates or the carbon from the grass into an animal is going to mean you're going to lose it in terms of there's obviously the energy regulation of the animal, there's the thermoregulation, all of that stuff. So the animal's got to move around. There's always going to be conversion loss as well. So we just have to accept that there is a limit to how much energy we convert. And so we don't want to have an ever increasing level of production that doesn't pay regard to how much energy we have to put in. Now that those laws of physics apply to closed systems, and the environment, essentially, obviously the sun can change a little bit, but essentially it's a closed system. But beef production isn't a closed system, so you can bring more energy in at your own cost. But we can also measure these increases in energy input through the animals within the system. So, in terms of actually, people will sell things like growth rates increasing, weaning weights going up, milk production increasing, conception rates higher, more marbling, quicker finishing, all of those things sold as improved genetics, but they could actually just be evidence for an increase in energy. If all of those things are going up at the same time, where's the energy coming from? And speaking to people who work in a lot of pedigree places, you just have to be careful if you're a grass-fed farmer, because people feeding up to 20 kilos of grain a day to bulls to get them to grow at these rates, unlimited or ad lib feeding of grain in the feed efficiency tests is just not applicable to what we do. And so we just need to be really careful, otherwise we're going to end up with cattle that are not going to pay the bills, and it's going to give us higher costs, and it's not going to be good for family farms. And speaking to a lot of the breeders, many of them know this, and they'll admit this freely, and they'll say it, but they'll tell you that those aren't the bulls that sell, and they have to produce the bulls that sell. So there's a responsibility on us as customers. If we're demanding these kinds of cattle, then maybe that'll produce a change in the breeding as well, which would be better for us, and it'd be better for the cattle too. Now we know that energy input's going up, but that energy isn't free, and the price of energy in all its forms is increasing all the time. We've got inflation going up all the time at the moment. So you have to be really careful about where we want the energy cost of our cattle to be. What are the energy requirements? And we have to be careful we don't change those too much to increase the energy requirements of those cattle, because the costs aren't going down. In terms of the crutches and the other ways we prop up our cattle, we don't worm cattle routinely. You only get native grasses, no high sugar varieties, reseeds, all that stuff. That's all extra energy, extra inputs, and you really should measure the cost of those inputs against the additional that you get, the additional income you get. And often I think I don't think there's a study that shows that reseeds from permanent pasture actually pay. I don't think I've seen one that show that, and most of them show that it doesn't pay. So just think about that in terms of what you're doing. We aim sort of at a permanent pasture or a forever pasture. We might try and improve it, we might try and add to it, but we're never going to reseed it. And we're aiming for the maximum volume of forage. Some of that might be low quality forage, for example, with the tall fescue swards, but we'll have cattle that can convert that higher volume, and we can keep more of those smaller cattle that can deal with a higher volume of lower quality forage and turn that into meat. So and that inevitably means for us anyway, smaller cows to cope with that environment. It does mean we keep our direct costs as low as possible, and the marginal costs too. So all of our cows are wintered outside. They're not in a shed. There's no concrete or steel involved there. Many cows have never been in a shed. So there's no dry bedding and high quality silage or anything like that. When they're in the driving rain or cold, wet winter, those days turn into weeks sometimes in a bad winter. We've been fairly lucky last few years. Hope that continues. But I think probably the biggest challenge we place on our cows is carrying their calves through the winter. Again, this is all about cost and support and different ways we're inputting energy into the system. So calving in May, June, we then wean at 10 months in March. Hopefully that's onto growing grass. It can change with the season. And that means the cows essentially get 60 days off, a bit like a milking cow, before they're then calving again. So they're working all year, and that's actually quite good feed for a calf, is to have a little bit of milk from mum, and some pretty rough grazing, and maybe a little bit of rolled out hay in the winter through the bale grazing. And I think, and if we do that, that saves us so much. It's the cheapest way to winter those calves, certainly the cheapest way to winter the cows that we've found. And, you know, the alternatives to that, you often see a weaning at sort of 5-6 months, maybe 7. And then those calves are going to have to be wintered inside. You know, you can put them out, but you're going to have, there's a bit of stress involved at the worst time of year for weather. You haven't got the best quality feed. You've got stress on those calves. So you're probably going to give them high quality feed, either grain feeding, or you're going to be looking at high quality silage to try and keep them gaining and keep them moving as quick as you can. So that, especially in terms of heifers, so that you can put them to the bull at least 15 months. So you're calving at 2. You got to keep them moving. And so there's a big cost to housing those calves in terms of the shed space, in terms of the straw, in terms of the work, the fuel, everything that goes into that. They're all energy costs. And we all know what's happening to energy costs. So here's an example of our cows. I think in that group, you can see that's in one of the bale pods, which is like a sacrifice paddock. But interestingly now, looking at the production on this farm at the moment, where we've done the most intensive bale grazing, where we've had bales placed closest, is where we've got the biggest production boost long term. That's definitely a learn for us. But I think there's about 89 cows in this group. The calves have just been weaned off them in March, so these are being held back off the pasture for a while. They get no help. They lose a bit of body condition over winter, and it's amazing once we take the calves off how quickly they gain their body condition back through end of March, April, and then into May as they start calving. It's so quick. It's incredible as that flush of grass comes through. So use the environment and nature intended. Here you can see some cows wintered. Herons always seem to hang around with them as well. It's lovely wildlife, and we're lucky to have a lot of parkland and wood pasture that we manage, so it gives them a bit of shelter. But that's all kind of a little bit of help for them, maybe, and maybe a bit of welfare as well. But that all comes for free in the environment, what the environment can provide. And so we have really what we're looking at with breeding is it's just another ecosystem process, something that happens within nature. It's often easy for us to just look at it as something that people do, but this absolutely happens in nature. We'll talk a little bit about sort of large herbivores in nature and how their breeding systems work. But essentially, this is for those of you who've looked at the ecosystem processes within holistic management. So this would fall into community dynamics. And in the right at the beginning of the chapter of community dynamics in the holistic management handbook, Alan Savory has a quote: "There's no such thing as a hardy animal." And when I read that first, I kind of just made me jump a bit and think, well, hang on, that's testing my thinking. I'm not sure I can quite agree with that. I've always thought about a hardy animal, and I think, but actually, when you think about it, he's absolutely right. We're not trying to create something that's hardy and tough. We're creating something that's a fit to the environment, and I think it's just a much better framing of what we're trying to do. When we talk about the environment being limited, or the environment just being what it is, we're trying to produce an animal that fits that environment, and that's really important, because if we then continually aim for higher growth rates and more performance or whatever that is, then we're going to be changing the genetics of the animal, and we're actually moving it away from a fit within the environment. And we want to find that balance with the environment in order that we're in balance with the ecosystems as well. And the process of environmental fit comes through adaptation. It comes through adaptation through the environment, initially through epigenetics, which we'll talk about in a bit, and then through evolution. And the difference between that is the evolution is that the change in the genetic code itself. Excuse me. And then the other thing we're looking at is population dynamics. So breeding the herd, it's the herd really that's adapting versus the individual animal. And that's a different focus that we have. The industry the commercial industry, or a lot of the the stuff that's promoted now, is pushes people towards focus on individuals, the individual animal that's going to change your herd, the genetics that's going to change your herd from individual performance. We're looking at the whole herd. So that's where essentially that's where the money comes from. That's where the calves all come from. So that environment that is being adapted to, you can see this is Bonsma's wheel, a guy called Jan Bonsma, and again we'll talk about him a bit later on, but you can see all of these different things in here. These are just some of the things that we have to adapt to: soil fertility, pH, ectoparasites, rainfall, humidity, nutrition, temperature, light, radiation, altitude, barometric pressure. All of these things have a big impact. And actually, if you look at latitude, has a huge impact as well. Like you move cattle from north of Scotland to the south of England, you see a huge change. Actually, often you'll have bigger cattle further north for various reasons, but if you move them and expect them to work exactly the same, that has a big impact. It's a big stress on the animal. So all of these different things means they're fit to their environment, and so really important that we sort of consider that, how they're interacting with all of these different things. So how do we achieve adaptation? In the past, it's always been about the bull, and you look through any breeding catalogue, on the whole you're just going to see the main focus is on what the male can do. That maybe speaks a little bit towards our society as well, but when we actually think about what the bull actually does for you, essentially for us, they're in with the cows for 60 days a year, so they get 10 months of the year off. The rest of the year we put all the bulls in together, so they have a bit of a scrap, and they might fight and work out their dominance hierarchy, and that helps a little bit with structure, because you find out anything with bad structure gets sort of tested with the fighting. And the main part of their genetics that they have actually does have an impact on structure. They pass on genetics. Is that terminal or maternal? We'll talk a bit about that. But what does the cow do for you? The cow carries that calf for 9 months while feeding another one for 10 months. She's the physiological center of production on your farm. She's the receptor and the interpreter of all the environmental signals that are coming into her all the time. And she's essentially that one part of the herd as a whole. So she's doing a huge amount in terms of that adaptation for you. But we didn't focus on the cow, we focused on the bull. And a big part of that is because my granddad always used to say to me, the bull's half your herd. Or the tup's half your flock. He was breeding pedigree sheep as well at the time, and that at the time, genetic theory, Mendel's law of segregation, meant that 50% of the genetics comes from the male, 50% of the genetics comes from the female, and this is so if you've got 30 cows, the assumption is that half the genetic material of the calves was from one individual, and the remaining 50% was split between 30 individual cows. So she only had an impact on her calf, but the bull obviously had the impact across every calf. And with that in mind, cattle geneticists actually abandoned the importance of cow families in selection. Herdsmen and women had worked with cow families and cows for years. They always knew the daughters of that cow line always worked here, or that's a milky line, or that's a really fertile line, or the structure of that line's like this. But that all went out the window. And I used to work for a charity called the Rare Breed Survival Trust, and we worked with a lot of the top geneticists in the country on conservation of genetic resources in terms of livestock. And I'd have conversations with them, and they convinced me back then that we need to get away from cow families, because it didn't add up in terms of genetic theory, in terms of the coefficient of inbreeding. And I was convinced they're the top people. But there's stuff that we actually knew about at that time that sort of leads us to think about how things might not have been correct. So when we're talking about adaptation as well, we're talking about not just genetic change, though. We're also talking about genetic change of bringing in, say, a bull and bringing in new genetics. We're also talking about epigenetics. And this is a massive part of adaptation. And epigenetics is essentially, it means over, epi means over or above genetics, so epigenetics. And it's the changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression. So when genes get switched on and off, you might have heard about that, rather than actual alteration of the genetic code itself. And I think the purest example of this is in a newly fertilized egg, where it then divides into 2, 4, 8, 16 cells, identical cells, and that's called a blastocyst at that point. Now, all of those cells are absolutely identical, and yet they're all going to become different parts of our body. And the genetic code in the nucleus of every one of those cells in the DNA is identical, more or less. And yet some of those cells will potentially one day become an eyeball or a bone marrow or a big toe or a hair follicle or whatever, a red blood cell, white blood cell, part of one of your the heart, one of your organs, whatever. And so they'll all be very, very different cells, but all have the same genetic code. And the reason they're different, though, is this miracle that happens in the womb. You think all these switches get turned on and off perfectly so that the cells all then change and move into the right places to then become a fetus and then a baby. And then it's pretty incredible when you think about it, how that all just happens. And so that's an incredible change in each of those, the future of it, how those cells are just from the switches going on and off, not a change in the code itself. We actually have adaptation to alcohol, so that's kind of within life changes. So if you drink a lot on holiday or whatever, or Christmas time, then what actually happens is that will give a trigger within your body, and you'll actually have switches will go on to change the production of enzymes that help break down alcohol faster, so that you can actually handle more alcohol. Maybe you get less of a hangover. So thank goodness for epigenetics. We also have changes that we've seen within life with cattle we've bought or we've taken on. So one of the farms we have a contract farming agreement where half the cattle are our pedigree Angus and half are on the estate belong to the estate, and they're red poles that were housed for 6-7 months of the year. And it's taken us 3 or 4 years of pretty hard selection on those now. When we got there and TB testing and different things, handling the cattle, we realized their skins, their hides seemed really thin because they were always wintered in, kept pretty tight. So the sheds were really warm, actually. Often you'd see the steam off the cattle were warm all winter, almost too warm. They had really thin hides. And then when we wintered them out, a lot of them didn't cope well. What we found is the ones that have left have actually changed their hides. Their hides are thicker now because of that adaptation within life. So there's some switch has gone on, and that adaptation has happened not just through generations, but also within life to the environment they're exposed to. So, the other thing to say is as well, that if you think about how the environment impacts, like the energy requirements and the metabolic efficiency of each animal, essentially that's the fit to the environment, is absolutely key, and all forms part of the family history and of each of those genes being switched on and off through time has an impact, not just from the generation within life, but previous generation switches can be left on from 2, 3, 4, 5 generations back. And then if we think about something else that happens as part of this epigenetic change, it's the role of mitochondria. And mitochondria are really important in that process. They are within the cell. You can see on the diagram there, and they have their own mitochondrial DNA as well. And they essentially provide energy for the cell by converting all the foodstuffs and things into ATP energy. They also regulate cellular metabolism. So if we're talking about metabolic efficiency being important, that's rather important. They regulate cell death. So when, for example, cells encounter the environment, then the signals that come from that encourage cells to be killed off if there's sort of negative things out there, or poisonous plants or whatever, ragwort, might be a bit of liver being killed off, or all of these sort of things are regulated by the mitochondria. There's a friend of mine in Canada, Aaron Nurbas, who's winters Angus cattle out at about -30, -40 in the winters, and actually sometimes they have much smaller ears, because actually a lot of the cells, a lot of the ears have been frozen around the edge, and then bits died off around the edge of the ears. They're pretty hard winters, but again, cell death, important part of that adaptation. And we've actually got some of Aaron's embryos that will be arriving in this country. We've got about 20 embryos coming in, really hardy cattle, and they should be arriving any day now. And so we'll be offering those out to people this year as well, and next. They also regulate the production of steroid hormones, very important for fertility, obviously, and also the regulation of innate immunity, the immune system, in terms of the white blood cells and things like that. So in terms of amino acid production for the breakdown of food, the growth and repair of body tissue, they make the hormones and brain chemicals, and they also, the peptide production as well, they regulate the chains of amino acids that form proteins in the body, so the muscle growth and things like that. These are all really key to the things we're trying to get animals to do, and that's all through the mitochondria. There's a really, really important role in that, and the mitochondrial DNA has some really interesting qualities that allow that to happen, and one of those is a higher rate of genetic mutation, so that allows that to have faster rates of adaptation, which makes sense when you think about it. It's not changing the actual genetic code itself, but just the mitochondrial DNA. But here's the thing, 99% of all mitochondrial DNA comes from the female. And so all of the stuff on the previous slide that we can look at there, we just talked all through. So everything that's coding from that through the mitochondrial DNA, 99% of mitochondrial DNA comes from the female, not the male. So suddenly, how important is feminine inheritance, that female line, with what we know now with mitochondrial DNA? Now, this was known before, but because we do science often in isolation and we're reductionist, we don't think about, we're just thinking about the genes rather than thinking about adaptation within an environment as well. And I think probably maybe all of the genetic code stuff and the high production stuff works if you're putting animals in a shed for 12 months a year and just feeding them as much as you can. Maybe that's correct. But for those of us in regenerative agriculture and grass-fed systems, outwintering cattle, it's really important for us how animals adapt. So that female line is very important for us. And what it turns out? Those cow women and cow men in the past, they were right about cow families. We should be looking at those. We should be protecting those at all costs. Protect the good ones and cull out the bad ones. There's a lot of people who will keep a cow family just because it's the last cow of that name or that family. But if it's not a good family, then I don't see the reason to keep it. But we want to look at cow families, see which ones perform, and that's going to be a big part of how we select within our herds to make sure. So if you can look through your cattle, look through your records and see which families are dominating, which ones are really productive, fertile ones, and you keep working towards those families. All the top breeders that I know have always worked on cow families, and that's what's given them their success. So we can do that on a commercial herd, a family herd. All of that works well for us. And so the spotlight should probably have been on the cow. That's Alenka. So she's 6'3", 4". She's probably my favourite cow. She's about, I don't want to say she's perfect. She's got a little lump in her tail, which I'd rather wasn't there. But the hip slope is there. The tail set might be a little bit high, but she's perfect. Her structure's lovely, and she's first cycle breeder every year. So it's just an example as we go through. So again, we talk about all of those things that the cows are adapting to all the time in the environment, and it's exciting that we get to kind of choose and see how this sort of stuff develops over time within our own herds on our own farms. So that's ecosystem processes. Adaptation is a big part of that through community dynamics. Another thing to consider is that we're all anti-fragile organisms, essentially, and this is anti-fragile is a term coined by, I don't think he was the first, but he sort of made it famous, Nicholas Taleb. But essentially that is a property of systems in which they increase in capability to thrive as a result of stresses, shocks, volatility, all of that sort of stuff. So essentially they become more resilient as they encounter things that stress it. And in terms of what we're doing in our environments, the biological organisms, we need stresses in order to adapt and become stronger or fit the environment. We think about, people who are kept indoors and, sanitize everything, never come in contact with bugs and germs, and their immune systems will be a lot weaker. In terms of vaccinations, we don't vaccinate anything now, and we, God willing, we won't have any problems, but we haven't had any problems with that. We're selecting on adaptation and things that thrive in those systems. You think about the crutches we provide livestock, we keep them inside all the time. We're always worming them. They're not actually coming into contact with those pathogens so that they can actually develop innate immunity to them. And thinking about what a cow can stand, going back to my friend Aaron, who's got cows out wintered at -40 in the winter. Our environment's actually pretty easy compared to where he farms. And using not too dissimilar genetics, we can actually, probably put a bit more stress on the animals without worrying too much, and keep our costs down as well as making them tougher and more adapted and stronger or a better fit for their environment. So I think many of us accept that we want to produce within the bounds of what the environment can produce sustainably. We don't want to be adding loads of chemical inputs harming the environment. And with a fixed supply of energy input, we need an animal whose energy requirements fall within what the environment can produce. That keeps our costs down and it keeps our risks down as well. And it means that if we get higher prices, talking to many people say, oh, well, the prices have been better, but costs have gone up more, so my margins are lower. Well, if you're in a low input system and prices go up, then your margins go up because you don't really have, there aren't the costs to go up in the same way. So your prices, however you achieve them, you're going to have higher margins. So we come back to what we want from a cow. Marketable calf every year, on time, problem free. It is that simple. But what my cows need to do, they need to be fertile, gets in calf first or second cycle, first if possible, maintains conditioning through the winter, while in calf and with a calf at foot until it's 10 months old. It calves correctly, pair bonds, but it's still approachable, cleans her calf, really important that they clean their calf. And it's why I really sort of begrudge having to tag calves so young, because we're calving outside. But if you can get that calf at the right time so it doesn't affect that pair bond, then she should clean her calf perfectly all the time, and that makes such a difference. Like if it's got a bit of a mucky bum one day and she's going to clean that up, that's going to go through her, come back out in the milk, and then there's going to be immunity provided through that. Cows that don't clean their calves I can't stand, and they don't last here long, so that's a really important part of our selection too. And we need a marketable healthy calf in good body condition every year, easily weaned from what the environment can provide. So we don't need the biggest calf, we just need one that meets market requirements. So where do we go wrong? You can see from the picture there, this is what we see sometimes, but this is what science has led us to. This is what we're supposed to do if you follow what all the science says in terms of we want to maximize production every turn. But these animals can't walk. And I heard a story this year, I think it was the Royal Welsh Show, that the champion British Blue actually had to be put on a trailer to do the grand parade because it couldn't walk around the ring. So that tells us, it's just ridiculous. It's crazy to think that's where we've got to. But with all our cleverness and all of our algorithms and everything, we've got the BCMS CTS data on calving interval. It's got an average of 426 days. That should be 365 or close to. That's the average though. So, more or less half are going to be worse than that. Age at first calving is an average of 34 months. Obviously we're at 24 months, aiming at 24 months. Average of 34 months means half are going to be over that. Now there might be other reasons that you tolerate some difference there, but it's not looking good. And all this data actually looks to be getting worse. In the US, data showing weaning weight hasn't increased in the last 30 years, despite growth rates apparently increasing. But most cow-calf producers out there, they have a set environment. They can't feed more than they've got. Fairly tough winters. And so the calves can only grow with what they're given. And so that extra productivity does not helping them. And of course, it changes the cows if you're keeping replacements from those calves. So you have to be careful. And suckler cow profitability in the sector is non-existent. We now have bigger cows that wean slightly bigger calves that have much higher energy maintenance costs requirements, and they're less fertile. So here's a question that I posed, and enjoy asking this one. It's just, why does one animal grow more than another? I don't know if anyone can put any answers in the chat, and maybe Rob can read out, because I can't see that while I'm doing the presentation. But I don't know if anyone knows why that is. If anyone's seen this presentation before, they might know. But you have, for example, you might have basketball players 7 foot tall. You've got Formula One drivers, 5'2". Why is there that difference? And if you have two people or two animals that are fed the same, why does one grow more than another? And often you'll get the answer of it's genetics, or it's to do with the feed, or it's but the main reason is what the difference in the genetics is coding for is it's coding for change in the hormones. So you have it changes the hormones. So you've got hormone selection for growth rate. So if you think about those basketball players, actually, I heard about something that happens in America with the basketball players is they look at the most talented kids, and there's no drug testing before they get into the NBA. And so what they'll actually do is they'll give the talented kids growth hormone, so they just keep growing. So they at least get up to sort of 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", or beyond, or up to 7 foot. So they get those growth hormones to get them to grow, and then of course the drug testing kicks in, and they've done their growing. And so it's just to show that the hormone balance and the hormone changes has a huge impact. But there's a problem with that, and that's because the balance of hormones between your reproductive hormones and the growth hormones is really important. And what particularly if we want to be breeding at 15 months and calving at 2, because you need that early sexual maturity. Because what happens is, as the animal gets older and the reproductive hormones, sex hormones, start to dominate the growth hormones, the growth plates on the long bones close, it stops growing, and then you get the development of the secondary sexual characteristics. So you tend to get that hip development, the pelvic development in a cow that makes her look more cowy. You have udder development, and you have that increase in the size, particularly of the rumen at the back, and to give you that wedge shape. And the bulls, you tend to get that thoracic development around the shoulders, the crest on the neck, and they get very bully, and they get more wrinkles on the head, the lines on the head as well. So all of those characteristics and the development of the testes, really important. So if you mess with the growth rate, because you're trying to get more production, you're messing with the hormone balance. But fertility is so important. And then there are also unintended consequences. It's not just selecting for growth, but also eye muscle, selecting for eye muscle areas. Some people will do, they'll have the sonogram stuff where they actually go and have a look and see what the eye muscle area is, and then they'll select on that basis. But that's associated with calving difficulty. And then you'll have, if you've got weaning weight, or are you selecting for growth rate there, or are you selecting for milk in the cows, or a bit of both? There's unintended, do we want more milk? And that's another energy requirement. And if you're selecting for feed efficiency, what are you selecting for with this measurement? If you're feeding, ad lib, unlimited amount of grain, you see which animals eat the least grain and grow the most, essentially. But you're looking at the animals that can eat the most grain, that have the biggest capacity to eat grain, or all of that stuff. And if you think about changes in feed efficiency, particularly if they're on the cows as well, milk's going to be a factor in there too. So you can be changing that. And then if we think about things we can do, just keeping the calves on until they're 10 months, as opposed to 5 and 6 months, that can have a difference of 20% as well in terms of feed efficiency. So just, that's something obviously we want in a grass-fed system. And actually have a grass-fed versus a grain-developed calf. That will be a 20% difference in rumen efficiency as well. And that what they actually see, the reason for that improvement is the villi, little fingers that are all across the whole surface of the rumen. There's more of them. They're denser because they develop in that late period before weaning, and particularly develop better on grass. So our systems give us that better environmental fit, essentially, even in terms of the rumen. So we don't perhaps need to have these other feed efficiency trials doing the same thing. Selection for marbling. Well, we probably only have a problem with marbling because we selected for growth rate and lean muscle and created the beef that doesn't taste much good. We have to be careful though, because marbling, if you look at hormonally balanced bull, will be higher in testosterone, and the bull higher in testosterone will naturally have leaner muscle mass. And so if you're selecting and scanning bulls to see what their marbling is, and you select those with the most marbling, you could be selecting against fertility. Again, you're messing with hormones, these unintended consequences. All the research I've seen as well on pairing antagonistic traits shows that if you have antagonistic traits, then that might be, for example, growth rate and fertility. If you're selecting for both things, you go nowhere. There's no change. There's no point doing that. And there's some good examples of how this has gone wrong. And calving ease is one. So selecting for calving ease and growth rate at the same time. What actually ended up happening was we ended up having the calving ease EBV that meant that estimated breeding value that people followed. And this led to calves that were born easily, but they were born easily and then they were selected for growth. So they were taller and narrow, so they came out easy. And then those narrow pelvises on those calves, they came into cows, and then they had calving difficulty because they had narrow pelvises. So selecting for calving ease led to calving difficulty. We couldn't have got it more wrong. And then there were developments, and now we have calving ease daughters, so we measure the calving ease on the daughters. But essentially, if you just select within a group and don't try and change your cattle genetics too much in terms of growth rate, and you just select out problems just like nature does, then you don't need any of these things. Selection for gestation length, shorter gestation length, and growth rate meant we ended up with premature calves that didn't stand up easily, had more problems at birth, didn't get colostrum, lots of knock-ons from that as well. So nothing is free. That's what the salespeople will tell you. Everything is a trade-off. The environment is limited and we're constrained by it, and we have to choose whether we want this extreme trait or that. We can't have, if all of these things that they're saying that we can have all at the same time, if we can have them all, where's the energy coming from? That's the reality of it. And if we're not careful, we're going to end up with cattle in systems that, that just need inputs. There's nothing free. And we're much better off, in my opinion, aiming for balance right at the center of that production, that it fits to the environment. It's better for welfare as well. I'm going to skip through some of this because it covers some of the same ground. I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but if we look at fertility is an important thing. So calving at 24 months and a calving interval of 365 days. Calving older heifers increases your heifer rearing costs. You've got to run those animals around longer, and those could be productive cows that are running instead of those heifers. So there's an opportunity cost there. That's a massive difference in terms of I just don't think it stacks up. And in this country, I think we can always calve at 2. And calving at 24 months old would increase the number of calves per cow over her lifetime. All the data shows that to be the case, largely because you're probably selecting the more fertile animals as well. So you've got a tighter calving block with fertility as well. And so you've got lower labour costs. So, that's the time of year when, labour's highest at calving. So you've got lower busy time as well in terms of time with family and all that sort of stuff. And also you've got a consistently aged calf crop, which makes a big difference. You can see here the heifer development that we have from, a few months before bulling on the left, and then that's the same animal in front of the same house on one of the on the National Trust place that we rent, and you can see that change, between 11 months and 19 months. So 8 months difference. You can see how she's become so much more cowy, and that was a lovely group of heifers we had in that group that's still with us now. And the costs of calving, pulling calves, they're not going to get in calf next time as well. You're far more likely to have fertility problems if you have to pull a calf, if you have a C-section. Fertility rates just drop off a cliff as soon as you start doing any of that stuff. And you just can't replace those extra calves. So, you can see some of the differences here. I'll leave this up. We'll put a summary sheet out, some of this information. We'll also share the presentation so you can see some of this as we go on. But you can see the extra at the bottom line. You can see extra 20,000 to the business from those extra calves, and trying to get that difference from extra weaning weight, is just you're going to lose fertility. You're going to have more calving problems. You're going to have other bigger costs coming in as well. So you just cannot get it that way. Fertility is the only way. This is our calf crop a year ago, 2 years ago. I can't remember when the picture was taken, but really even calf crop across the groups. They're all growing at the same rate. You've got a saleable group as well. But also, if you have a big gap, say you're calving over three or 4 months, you're often here, then the calf born, if you look at calf A, by the time calf B is born, look at calf A at the top, it's already, in that 3-month period, it's probably grown 100 kilos. So you've already lost 100 kilos of productivity over that time. That had nothing to do with growth rate. It was all to do with fertility, about them all being born at the same time. So again, fertility is really, really important. That tight calving group's really important. The other thing to think about is, I know we've got some of but that should be bulling at 15 months versus 12 months. And so this is just to point out that if you have 3 months between the first and the last calf, and you're trying to get those to calve at 2, then you're going to have you're going to have that long bulling period just to get them all in calf again. Those younger calves are going to struggle a lot more, and they're always going to be the cows that end up dropping out. Whereas if you can get a cohort of calves all the same age, then you've got a much better chance of getting higher conception on the heifers. So it makes a big difference there. The other thing to think about, I realise I'm going slightly over, but we did start a bit late, so I'm sure Rob will give me a shout if I need to shut up. But if we look at what nature does in terms of age at first partition, first birth, it all seems to relate to mature size. And so again, if we're selecting for growth rate in the calves, we're going to end up with bigger cows, and that's going to influence our ability to calve at 2. And so you can see here where the cows in the middle of that, those are listed from common foal down to elephant. I think they're all herbivores. But we end up with the elephant having first birth at 14 to 17 years, the rhino at 7 to 9 years old. And, as you go down in size, it gets younger and younger. And obviously the common vole, they don't live for long, so they're breeding at 1 to 2 months. Sorry, giving birth at 1 to 2 months. And so what's really important is the mature size has a massive impact on that. And so if it may well be that you have cows that can't currently produce or calve consistently at 2. It may just mean that you need to have cows with a slightly lower energy requirement and select for that over time. And I think just be careful with selection. Don't do too much too quick. But if you're calving at 3 currently, and then aim to get really, really tighten that calving window. So maybe you just bring that back to 60 days if you're doing exposing for longer. So your 60-day calving, bring that back to 45 days or 42 days. So that's only 2 cycles. And then maybe you could even start bringing it even tighter if you want. But certainly you want to get down to that 42 days, still calving at 3. And when you get there, you've got fertile animals. So then if you start trying to calve them at 2, then at least you're working with good genetics. if you go in straight away without doing that improvement, you're going to have a much higher cull rate, a much higher open rate if you try and move to calving at 2. And that's often something that people find, and it's a risk. And so you have to you've got to run a business that's profitable at the same time. Another thing you can do as well is select on the basis of when they calve. And so you can either take notes and only keep heifers that are born in the first 42 days, or 21 days if you want to do first cycle, or 60 days or whatever, but certainly no more than that. Some people will take a bull out. Maybe if you've got Angus bulls running, you could then put a Hereford in after 42 days or 60 days, and then all the calves from that point on will have a white face, so you know not to keep any of those. White-bred shorthorn, you could do something similar, just to have a different coloured calf as a result of, for those that are coming later, so so you can use that, or you can just keep a note if you're happy with your records. But sometimes it's always tempting to keep those. You see a really nice heifer, but she's the wrong age. I think sometimes if you use a different coloured bull, then it just tells you shouldn't keep it, and you've got to stick to what you decided to do rather than being tempted to keep some that are going to cost you in the future. So I'm going to skip through some of this because I've yabbered on too long. But I will just go through, see if I can find a bit about the deer. So the deer populations are interesting. So I think it's worth looking at what happens to those. So if you think about in nature, what tends to happen, you can read these quotes. There's some lovely quotes that Heather Haying and Brett Weinstein, husband and wife, wrote a book 2021. Really, really good, looking at all of this sort of stuff. And it's interesting looking at deer populations where you'll have often a quite closely related harem of females that then will have a stag. And then if that's a really dominant stag, that could stand that harem for 6-7 years. So we're definitely breeding on his daughters. But what you'll end up then with is some inbreeding depression. And so then you'll tend to have inbreeding depression might lead to slightly lower fertility, but you'll probably also get slightly lower growth rates. And then so his sons will probably be less impressive. They'll be less, they won't have the hybrid vigor that he has. And so particularly as he starts breeding on his daughters, and there's more of that. So it's less likely that one of his sons will be the one to displace him. It'll be a stag with hybrid vigor from somewhere else that comes in and does that. So nature kind of managed that, and it's kind of going in sort of tighter inbreeding, and then a little bit more outside blood coming in as part of that natural process. That just kind of gets managed, as a system, and that's something we do. With our bull Kaiser, we use, we've used Kaiser on his daughters, and then him on his daughters. He's had daughters, his granddaughters, out of daughters by him. We've put him on those again, and have still had no problems because he was line bred before, and all the problems bred out. His lines have all been cleaned out of any genetic problems. So we're confident of doing that. That way we fix characteristics. So the fertility, the good udders, the good structure he has. And we've been able to put that into the herd, which made a big difference to us. And then we'll go through some of this. There is some more here. And I'll finish just talking about Jan Bonsma. And his monitoring and selection. We saw Bonsma's wheel earlier on. He was a cattle scientist from South Africa, Dr. Jan Bonsma, incredible guy. And he wanted, when we look at monitoring and selection, we think about those estimated breeding values that I've been very critical of. There's a good intention behind that because it takes a long time to know about a cow. If she's had a calf every year for 10 years, then you really know about her. And you can then use a bull from her and be confident what it's going to do. But that's a long time to wait to find anything out. So the estimated breeding values are trying to give you that data now so you can make the selection now so you can have quicker genetic progression. Bonsma wanted to make sure that what if we could do that from visual assessment? What if we could look at an animal and see which was more fertile? And that would save us time. And so he actually had, I think it was Stellenbosch University, he looked at something like 40,000 live animals and looked at their whole breeding history. And he was able to get incredibly accurate to save that time in terms of saying what those animals would be. Those 40,000 cows gave him an incredible base, and he went over to the States and did 1,000 cow assessment where they put 1,000 cows through the ring, and then they had I think out of 850, so about 85% of those cows, he was 100% correct on their breeding record, including whether they'd been flushed and all that sort of stuff. And so he wanted a physical assessment of phenotype for the practical farmer, so they could just look at and see what the deal was. Again, the wheel of adaptation that they'd adapted to. This is just looking at all of the different things that we give to animals that provide a sort of a crutch to animals. So we've talked about a little bit about the skeletal development, about those long bones closing that stops the long bones from growing when the reproductive hormones dominate the growth hormones. And that gives us skeletal clues as to what's going on with the hormones and the hormone balance, and therefore the fertility. So you can see this is just a demonstration from his book, Livestock Production, of a steer at the top, castrated at 6 months, steer castrated at 2 years, and then a bull at the bottom. And you've got the different skeletal development depending on whether or not they had access to their hormones. You see the same in dairy cows. It's a non-fertile cow at the top and a fertile cow at the bottom. You can see that one's very feminine, one looks a bit more butch and muscular. And and often actually in terms of heifer selection growing up, dad and granddad would often, we'd lean towards the more muscular type because we wanted more better carcass animals, but we were actually selecting against fertility in doing that. So, but the hormone balance has a big impact on the skeleton. And there you can see that finer bone. It's actually nice flat bone. And then that's 634 again. You see that udder, she's got fine flat bone. She's very feminine front-ended, the wedge shape to the back, nice udder. This is only as that was as a heifer, so first carver. Lovely hip slope on her. And you can see that prominent shoulder. And that's absolutely key. So if you think about that long bone closing, on the left, you can see the subfertile cow, and the chine bones on top of the spine have kept growing up above the scapula. Whereas you can see on the right-hand picture, you can see the scapula is proud above the chine bones. And what you'll see is as the animal walks, the scapula should rotate above the chine bones as it walks on both sides. And probably at rest, if it's putting its head down, there should be a little bit of a dip between them if possible. And that's a sign, if you have got a proud chine bone, you'll see this on a lot of sort of Holstein type steers with the high growth rates. Maybe with a high growth rate bull put on the Holsteins, you'll see that, and it just shows a lack of fertility, a lack of hormone balance. And then this is from a guy called Darius Meitler. They've been using Bonsma, actually visited the farm and set them up with the breeding program. They've been using Bonsma principles for years. So you can see just the shoulder and the U neck in front of the shoulder. You can see that shape you've got there. And then the other impact of those growth rates, if you look at the femur as well, now there's a big problem with, look at the length of the femur. So because that growth rate increases, you can see the length of the femur increasing, and it's pushing up the pin bone on the right-hand side there. So you've the hook to pin, the hip to the pin bone is that angle is no longer there. And that hip structure is so much more important than the pelvic measurements they do from side to side. It's far more important to have the measurement from top to bottom, or to have that hip slope. Because if you've got a hip slope, you won't have a problem calving. The other thing that happens if you don't have the hip slope is that if there's any problem or bleeding, then it doesn't drain out of the vulva, it drains back into the womb. And so you've then got a problem which is going to cause infertility. And that's all down to the continued growth of that femur because you selected for more growth rate. So what we want is balance, a balanced animal that fits its environment, not stuff we've messed around with. It's interesting when you look at some of the breeds like the Solaires that have selected on the basis of pelvic measurements on the width of the pelvis. They've ended up with bigger and bigger and bigger pelvises, and so they've got bigger and bigger and bigger cows. Now they do calve easy, those cows, but they've now got bigger cows with higher energy requirements. And so what you want to have a look at is just if you select on hip structure rather than the pelvic opening, and you've got that hip slope, then you won't have an issue. If you look at a horse, it's got a really nice hip slope, and they tend to be okay foaling. Look at any wild mammal, and it's got a much more extreme hip slope than you'll see in any cow. And there's just some pictures showing the hip slope from hook to pin. That's a big cow, but you can see the prominent shoulder and the hip slope there. I won't go into that. That's a heifer on the hill. This is from a customer in the Welsh Hills, and good friend Geraint. We won't go into some of this, but you can see the shoulder again, the prominent shoulder and the hip slope in these. And you can see you've got cows that look in good production. And some people will talk about a high tail being a problem. It's only a problem if the hip slope isn't there, so the pin bone is as high as the tail is. If the tail's up out of the way, it's not a problem as long as you've got that hip slope there. And this is just to go through seeing these different views. So prominent shoulder, bit of a hip slope. You can see the wedge shape in all of these. Herefords as well. These have all been bred to Bronzema principles. You can see that they're feminine, but they're also really fit animals as well. And then I finished then on a slide. This is Old Granny. She's the first Angus in the Angus herd book. And I think that's in 1854 or 64. I get it wrong. But she was the first one in the herd book because of her breeding record. Now, she calved at 2. And then she had a calf every year until she was 27. And then they kept her alive and sort of treated her. And she died at the old age of 33. But the look of the picture, they probably should have culled her a bit earlier. But she's, I just like to think, with all our cleverness and all our breeding and everything we've done, how far have we come? How far have we improved in our breed since the very first cow in the herd book? And I'm not sure we've come that far, to be honest. So anyway, that's the end of the presentation. I'm happy to take a few questions. I'm sorry I went on a bit long.
Okay, as expected, Rob. Lots to think about and hear about. There are a few questions in the chat, so we'll zip down quickly while you're just stopping sharing. So Simon's asked, they're all sort of quite focused to your production system. So how are the calves weaned from the cow, i.e., this process system used? So yeah, when you're weaning in March, what are you doing?
Well, a good thing about weaning at 10 months is that the calves are slightly less interested. About 60 days before calving, the cow's, if she's in calf, the cow's milk shuts off anyway. So the calves actually, if the calves can learn that I think often some of the Angus actually shut off a bit sooner than that. So if the calves learn that there's not milk there, then they'll actually wean really easy. And we've seen that. And so we've weaned fence line weaning with electric fences and done that just the other side of a single strand electric fence, and that's worked in the past. But because we tend to run our calves on a different site now, I just wean them straight off and ship them. And to be honest, I just put them on a wagon, take them to the other farm, and they're quiet. The cows are pretty delighted to get rid of them at 10 months, and it's worked well for us.
Okay, Alan's asking about the grass improvement bale. So why did you get such an improvement in grass production on your bale pods, do you think?
I think a lot of it is because you've got that mineral cycle gets that pump priming. So you've got a lot of fertility in terms of manure and urine being dropped in that year. You've got a lot of, in the first year when you do the intensive bale graze, you'll leave a fair bit of litter behind, and it takes about 6-7 months for that to break down, and you'll definitely lose production the following summer. But the year after, that'll be the most productive part of the field. And so if I look, we do record where we put our bales on AgriWeb, and then we can see where they were the year before. And if we can put them in the gaps the following year, then that fertility gets spread around the field.
Okay. Dustin's just asking about the CTS data. Is it beef and dairy?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think it was from a beef. It was from the AHDB beef data that they pulled it out of CTS. So
Okay. Bill's brought a question up about marbling. So why is marbling a problem? Isn't traditional pasture fed beef meant to have it?
so yeah, I agree entirely that many of our native breeds, most of them, in fact, have perfect amount of marbling to have a really good steak. So, but and so I just don't think there's anything for us much to change there. If you've got an animal that's in good body condition within the environment, then it's going to have good marbling in our native breeds. The problem is the reason why we've had to select for marbling is particularly in certain breeds. Um, there's been selection for growth rate and essentially selection for lean muscle mass. And if you're selecting for lean muscle mass, because it takes 5 times the amount of calories to put on a kilo of fat than it does to put on a kilo of muscle. So these are those unintended consequences. When we select for growth rate, we end up selecting for the what is most efficient to produce, which is muscle, or the easiest to produce per calorie in. And so what we've ended up is selecting for leaner animals, which isn't good for the customer. It's not a good eating experience. And so suddenly we need to have more marbling to have a good steak again, whereas there was never a problem before. So I think that's the key is actually stick to our native breed. They don't need altering. They've got plenty of marbling. Um, but what I'm saying is if you select for extremes, and people are doing that with the advent of Kobe beef, a lot of people are interested in the Wagyu cattle. But if you talk to anyone who's produced Wagyu at any sort of scale with purebred Wagyu, they're massive fertility problems, lots of structural problems, and they're very hard keeping cattle. They've got very high energy costs. And so just be very careful what you wish for on that. But yeah, a good native breed has got perfect marbling. You don't need to change it.
Okay. Teresa's put a comment about the Chillingham cattle. Anik, I think I know the ones you mean, Teresa. Yeah, they're 100% inbred, so we're all clones of each other and exactly fit for their environment.
Yeah, that's a good example, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Is there
Yeah.
anybody on the floor that wants to come on with any questions at all? Oh, Dave Kelly's just put one in. But sorry, Rob, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say the only thing is obviously that they have, any time we put fences around cattle, we take that they're no longer natural. They'd be roaming over very large areas in a natural system. So,
David Kelly's brought a little bit of sheep to it. So he's just asking, as we approach our TUP ram sales, what would you be looking for or asking to the breeders? Make it relative.
So I think for me, it's always fun to go. When we used to have sheep, it was always fun to go to the ram sales and breeding sales and all that. But we've all had the experience of going and buying it up and taking it home, and it falls apart because it's been fed cabbages and everything else under the sun, and it doesn't get that when it's out working on the ewes. So I think the key is to find sort of more commercial or real system farmers rather than the specific pedigree breeders. There are people out there producing cattle and sheep that are not fussed over. They're not given loads of inputs. So I would try and buy off farm if you can, and see the system and really know how much they're fed.
So do you think we might see a day one day when the sort of the sterling bull sales are not as much as they are now? I'm trying to be tactful here, but yeah, do you think there might be a day when there's not a sterling bull sale because the animals aren't fit for purpose?
I think if they're not careful, I think those events actually, it's a shame that I can't take bulls to that sale because they don't meet the weight requirements for age. So the 12-month animals, I think they have to be 650 kilos at 12 months or whatever it is. I might have that wrong, but essentially my bulls are not heavy enough because they haven't been fed enough, so I can't even take them there. And I just think it's a shame because those are really important community events, and these should be, family farms need cattle that perform to keep the family farms going, and they also need these community events. So it'd be a shame if that was the case. What I'd love to see is for these sales to actually be more practical and more related to the farms where these animals are going to be working on than to a feedlot.
Don't think we've got any more questions. Oh, Bill Grayson's put a real Sterling Bull sale question mark.
Yeah. One of the organic, the real, yeah.
The
real farming conference, isn't it? Yeah.
Like what you've done there, Bill. So yeah, I suppose. Well, I'll take the last question and then we'll get wrapped up. So I know you are a Nuffield scholar. On a sort of personal front, if you got the chance to do another one, what would be your topic of choice? What would you like to delve in a bit further?
I wouldn't do another one.
That's a cop-out answer.
Yeah, I think probably it's kind of how we there's maybe something around that maybe it's not for one person, it's for all of us to look at, is how we can bring community back into, I think Pasture Fed Livestock Association does a great job of this, but the more local community stuff around our farming systems and getting the farming community events and things as much as we can related into what we're doing with the breeding and what we need to do on that front. I think that'd be good.
So people rather than animals. Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, that pretty much wraps us up. So big thanks to you, Rob. Really appreciate your time on, I'm sure, what's been a busy day into quite late into the evening. Really big thank you to everybody for joining us. We've got one small ask that you'll be familiar with evaluation